And Mesothelioma UK was founded out of the NHS. The team that I worked with at Leicester, we founded Mesothelioma UK as a Macmillan Cancer Support Service originally, and then we launched as an independent charity about 12 years ago. But I'm also now the chief executive of Mesothelioma UK, and it started off as just a pretty much a one-man band and has grown now to be quite a formidable team of individuals, all dedicated really to, I suppose, the other end of the kind of asbestos legacy we have in this country that you're working at. But there's lots of synergy between what we do, and I'll be glad to share some of that with you. And I apologise that some of this presentation, I guess, is a bit dour. I think looking at the shameful realities really of what our asbestos legacy is causing in the UK, it makes hard reading really, and it is not, it's not a very uplifting presentation. And this is a clinical perspective because first and foremost, obviously, I am a clinician, although, as I say, I lead the charity. I still hold on very dear to my clinical practice and working with, but really being with people who are suffering from the consequences of mesothelioma is my raison d'etre. It's what makes me get up in the morning, and most of the team, I would say, at Meso UK. So this is what I'm going to cover, and I want to really thank Colette and Ben for inviting Meso UK and giving us the opportunity. And I would just say that this presentation has been put together for you all today, but we've got a whole bank of material that we can call on at Meso UK. And for any of you in your individual organisations, at any time, if you would like somebody like me, one of the nursing team, Lorraine's on the call today, she's our head of nursing. If you would like somebody to come and just share some material with your teams or other groups and organisations, we'd be really glad to, because we're always really glad to have the opportunity to spread the gospel a little bit about asbestos-related diseases. So I'm going to talk a bit about asbestos-related disease, who gets the disease, the different types, and of course I'm going to concentrate on mesothelioma. I've got a couple of patient stories that I wanted to share with you. I think that you are the converted. I don't need to preach to you all, but I think the general population, the general public who don't have asbestos, in their working day on a regular basis, think that it's a disease that happens to somebody else, think that it's probably a disease that happens to people who are laggers, power station workers, people working in the asbestos industry. And that's sadly not the case. And so I've got a couple of, and I think they also think that it happens to all old men, and that again is not the case. And I've got a couple of patient stories that highlight that. And then I'm also going to tell you a little bit about the charity. So asbestos related diseases, again, you may know this, but this is the latest data that was, it was last year, not this year. Sorry, I've headed that slide wrong. That's not a very good start. So over 5,000 people die of asbestos related diseases each year in the UK. And most of those are mesothelioma, but there are people who die of lung cancer related to asbestos exposure, and also people still dying of asbestosis. Mesothelioma, about 2,500 deaths per year, about 2,700 cases per year. And then for asbestosis, about 503, the last count, deaths that mentioned asbestosis. And when I was looking at the stats just recently, I had always thought that asbestosis, the numbers of deaths, was decreasing, but that isn't the case yet. And, asbestosis is a disease that you contract after having quite heavy exposure. So I think we're still seeing, a number of people develop asbestosis through heavy exposure as a consequence of, of working with it in the last century before we regulated and then went on to ban it. So who gets asbestos-related diseases? Well, the reality is anybody. I don't think anybody in the UK is spared the risk of being exposed to asbestos, and therefore consequently the risk of developing an asbestos related disease. Some of those diseases are dose related, but the more sinister ones are not. And mesothelioma particularly, allegedly one fibre is sufficient to cause mesothelioma. There's lots of debate about how carcinogenic the different types of asbestos are, and chrysotile, you know, there is still a lot of marketing to advocate the use of chrysotile in other parts of the world, and kind of overlooking its potential cancer-causing properties. From, you know, when we see people clinically, we don't pick over whether or not they've been exposed to brown, blue, or white asbestos, but we are just interested in whether they've been exposed to asbestos. But I have it on quite good authority that there are people who have developed mesothelioma, and the only asbestos exposure identifiable in their working history is white asbestos. There's lots of concern about the number of healthcare professionals we're seeing with meso, the number of teachers we're seeing with mesothelioma, and we've done some work recently as a charity looking at the impact of mesothelioma on our armed forces. So I think, in short, you know, anybody can go on to develop asbestos-related diseases, and the concern is about the more sinister mesothelioma in particular. These are 3 studies that Mesothelioma has funded and completed in collaboration with our Centre for Research that we fund at the University of Sheffield. One of them, the gendered experience of mesothelioma, or GEMS, looked at the difference between men and women, really. We had a hunch that women's experience of mesothelioma was different to men. It's a male-dominated disease. And there were some really quite fascinating findings from that, and not least that, you know, women struggle to get compensated more. They receive less in compensation. Often takes longer to diagnose women because the index of suspicion for an asbestos-related disease in women is lower than it is for men. The MAG study, the lady on the front there is a young doctor called Mags Portman. She's an award-winning doctor. She absolutely moved heaven and earth to improve healthcare for people with HIV in this country, and won awards for her work, and more importantly was absolutely almost worshipped by some of the HIV community. Mags was exposed to asbestos as a young doctor working in Scotland, and went on to develop mesothelioma and died 2.5 years ago now, in her early 40s, leaving husband and young children. And we made a promise to Mags that we would do all we could to shine a light on issues about asbestos exposure to healthcare workers. And we're still working on that currently. And then the final one is the MIND study. And this was our team of nurses were quite concerned about the number of veterans they were seeing with mesothelioma. And again, we wanted to shine a light on that and really capture the impact of mesothelioma on our armed forces. And really, we took the stance that, you know, people in our armed forces who have dedicated parts of their working life to serving our country, if we can't get things right for them, then we felt it was a bit of a poor show. And so that was published last year, that study, and we've been delighted to be working really closely with the MOD, who said that, you know, we very subtly but succinctly have held them to account for the asbestos exposure across the armed forces, and they now have a very rigorous health and safety plan to address that. So see some of the diseases that I'm going to talk about: pleural plaques, diffuse pleural thickening, asbestosis, mesothelioma, and lung cancer, and pretty much in that order as well. So many of you will know some of this, so forgive me if I'm you know, teaching to suck eggs. If I do this face to face, I have a big Tommy torso that I take with me, which is basically a big model of a human chest torso that I would be taking to pieces to demonstrate what this looks like. But for now, I'll have to manage in this way. This is a picture, a chest x-ray of the lungs. So if you imagine the person is standing facing you, so what we see is the right is their left lung, and on the left is the right lung. Anything black on a chest x-ray is good because that's good air entry, and anything white that's a bit fuzzy is either an organ or a structure, so bone or the heart. You can see there in the middle, we can see the diaphragm at the bottom and the abdominal contents. But anything else other than that is a bit of concern. You can see the arrows pointing there to 2 areas of pleural plaque. So the asbestos has worked its way to the edge of the lung, poked through a little bit, and then as the chest has expanded and contracted, it's caused a bit of a blister or a plaque on the surface of the lung, on the pleural lining of the lung. that is evidence of somebody being exposed to asbestos. And there isn't a lot of hard evidence to say that if you've got pleural plaques, then you're more inclined to go on to develop some of the more sinister pleural asbestos-related diseases. But we do know that, you know, they are often very apparent when we diagnose people with lung cancer with an asbestos exposure history or mesothelioma, for instance. Then it's often that we can find evidence of pleural plaques. So this is a CT scan showing pleural thickening. And if you can imagine that pleural plaque, that blister, if it expands and takes over more of that lining of the lung, that pleural lining, it causes a thickening, a bit like if you imagine that pleural lining of your lung, it's a very stretchy, elasticated lining that can stretch with inspiration and expiration. It's a bit like the skin on a sausage. It's a membrane that covers your lungs and actually lines your chest wall. And if that becomes blistered or thickened with a pleural plaque or large areas of pleural thickening, it becomes very restrictive. So this is a CT scan that you're looking at, chest X-ray on the left, CT scan on the right. I'm going to concentrate on the CT scan. If you imagine that person's laying flat on their back, their head is away from you and their feet are towards you, and this is a slice of their chest cavity. The large white structure is their heart. You can see around the edge, the very bright white areas are their ribs, because it's a slice through their ribs. And if you can see at the back, at the bottom, if you can see where the arrow is pointing, these thickened areas here, this is pleural thickening. And for many people, if it's very limited, they don't even know they've got it, it's found coincidentally. It's only when it's really progressed quite significantly that they actually start to get signs and symptoms of restriction of their lung. That pleural thickening doesn't stretch in the same way as the pleural would do normally. When it's like a skin on a sausage, it becomes restrictive and they start to experience breathlessness. So now I'm going to just talk a little bit about asbestosis. It's quite a different disease. The two that I've just explained to you are diseases of the lining of the lung, the pleural lining of the lung. Asbestos is very indestructible. It's worked its way through the chest wall, poked its way through the edge of the lung, become lodged there and caused a problem in the lining of the lung. Asbestosis is where the asbestos fibres have come to rest in the lung tissue itself, the lung tissue where oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged. And when it's become lodged in that lung tissue, it has caused an area of inflammation that eventually, over a period of time, become hardened and thickened and no longer can play a part in exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide. And as more parts of the lung become affected, obviously that results in the person becoming breathless, and it's irreversible and it is progressive. And this is just a slide that is from the HSC. I screenshotted this just last week, and it shows you the latest statistics for people who have mesothelioma here. And this is the projected deaths of mesothelioma. And this line down here is the asbestosis claims for industrial injuries disablement benefit. And you can see it has slowly continued to rise. So this is not a disease of the past. It is an ongoing problem. It can be a cause of death, but it's a much slower, longer journey than mesothelioma or lung cancer. And it's a disease of the lung tissue itself, not to be confused with the pleural-based diseases, which are more common following asbestos exposure. This is a typical chest X-ray of asbestosis. Remember, I said that really dark black areas in a chest X-ray are good and healthy because that shows good area of gas exchange. You can see here it's a bit like cotton wool, and this is the areas of asbestosis that have become damaged and hardened and fibrosed. It's a term we use an awful lot with lung disease, become fibrosed through exposure to asbestos. And remember, I said this is irreversible and it is progressive. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about cancer, and just to put it in context, really. So we have a high incidence of cancer in the UK, roughly per annum, about 370,000 cases of cancer per year in the UK. Now, the vast majority of those cancers are either bowel cancer, prostate cancer, breast cancer, or lung cancer. So lung cancer is one of the top 4. And if we just look at the number of deaths from cancer, you can see the vast majority of people, over 200,000, will survive their cancer. But a proportion of people, a big proportion of people do die as a consequence of their cancer diagnosis. And in reality, half of people across all cancers will survive 10 years or more in England and Wales. Of those 370,000 cancers, 38% of them are thought to be preventable. And the big causes of cancer are sunlight, if we think about melanoma and skin cancer, obesity, smoking, lack of exercise, poor diet and alcohol are the real big causes of cancer. But generally across the board, 38% of cancers are thought to be preventable. And if we just look at lung cancer now, I'm going to have to just alter my appearance of my slides because I can't see. If we think about just lung cancer for now, so lung cancer is one of the more common cancers. I think it might be the second most common cancer after breast cancer. Nearly 48,000 people a year in the UK diagnosed with lung cancer, and 35,000 people die of that lung cancer per year. Just 10% of people with lung cancer will survive 10 years or more. And it is thought that 79% of lung cancers are preventable. And of course, smoking is the biggest contributor to causing lung cancer, but asbestos exposure is also a cause of lung cancer independently of smoking. So if you've never smoked but been exposed to asbestos, you can still go on to contract lung cancer. If you've been a smoker and you have been exposed to asbestos, there is a synergy between those two. So the asbestos exposure actually heightens the effect of the smoking. So it really is bad news for people who have been heavy smokers and heavy exposure to asbestos. This is a typical picture, chest x-ray of a lung cancer. So again, this is the right lung, this is the left lung. The left lung is always a little bit smaller because it only has 2 lobes, because it has most of the heart is on the left side of the chest. This is the middle of the chest. This is the right clavicle and the left clavicle. This is your diaphragm. The liver's just under the diaphragm. This is your stomach. Everybody's stomach's got a bit of air in it. Some people who belch a lot have got more than others. So there's always a nice bit of black air in the stomach there. And the right lung's a little bit bigger. So this is all kind of very normal and healthy looking. But you can remember I said that anything that is white is unhealthy usually in a chest x-ray. And you can see this very rounded opacification, that's the term we tend to use, a rounded area here where we know that oxygen and carbon dioxide is not able to exchange because it is blocked by this large tumour here sitting in the left lung. And this is a very typical presentation of a lung cancer. And as I say, lung cancer can be attributed to asbestos exposure, but it's much harder to prove that causation. But we do try to ensure that anybody with an asbestos exposure that develops lung cancer gets the same kind of benefits and legal advice that somebody with a mesothelioma would get. So now I'm going to just talk about mesothelioma. And of course, this is the disease that, myself and Lorraine have dedicated a big part of our professional career to. I think Lorraine and I both worked in lung cancer, and as a nurse working in lung cancer, the caseload that I worked with, I would probably see somewhere around 400 lung cancer patients a year, and maybe only 20-25 people with mesothelioma. And they really were the kind of Cinderella cancer in that group. I felt very inadequate, not sure how best to support them, very limited treatments. And you can't help but when you are confronted with people who are backed against the wall more than anybody you can ever imagine. They are the most vulnerable cancer patients, the most needy cancer patients. You can't help but want to just, do what you can to help them. And, I'm telling you a little bit more about the cancer now. But I think you'll understand how it's been quite a privilege, Lorraine and I would say, to be able to earn a living, working with people in this awful situation. So mesothelioma is a cancer of mesothelial cells, and mesothelial cells are found in our covering and lining tissue. in the body. And remember, I said it's the pleural lining of the chest cavity that is most commonly affected, and it's like a skin on a sausage. And that membrane is made up of mesothelial cells, and it is a cancer of those mesothelial cells that is caused by the exposure to asbestos. But that same lining is also found in your abdominal cavity, and it's also found in testicles. So men can get mesothelioma of the testicles. But I won't dwell on that too much, but I will just reassure you a little bit about why we don't see that much of that. Of course, it's far more common to get mesothelioma of your chest cavity because asbestos can penetrate and enter your chest cavity very easily because we breathe it in, because it's airborne. It's much harder for the asbestos to get into your abdominal cavity and work its way through to the lining of your abdomen, which is the peritoneum. You have to either ingest and eat the asbestos, on your packed lunch in the middle of a asbestos fueled environment, or sometimes it can actually be breathed in and work its way through the lung and then through the diaphragm into the abdomen. So just some of the issues around a mesothelioma diagnosis. So in the UK, it's tragic that we have the highest incidence of this disease in the world, and it directly correlates to our use of asbestos. The incidence is unrelenting. Epidemiologists in the past have predicted that based on our use of asbestos in the past and the latency, so the period between being exposed to asbestos and developing the disease, there's been lots of predictions to say that we should have reached our peak and be over the hill now and seeing reduced numbers of mesothelioma. But that's sadly not the case. And, many of us believe that is because of our managing asbestos in situ, that we still have asbestos freely circulating in the environments. And remember, low levels of asbestos can cause mesothelioma. So it's a fatal disease, completely avoidable. And when we look at the statistics for the other cancer, remember 38% was it, and 78% of lung cancer is avoidable. Something like over 90% of mesothelioma is avoidable. People have a very short life expectancy. Half of people will die within a year. There are hardly any 10-year survivors with mesothelioma. It's very symptomatic. This is a scan that you can see here. The left lung, as you can see, all that white area is the pleural lining becoming thickened and restrictive. That left lung is hardly able to move because of the restriction caused by the mesothelioma. It's still relatively rare. Patients, it's hard to diagnose, it's hard to get a biopsy, and it's hard to differentiate it under a microscope. And so people often go through very lengthy and complex investigations. I said that a vast majority of people will die within a year, and during that year, they will also, not only will they be navigating the healthcare system and trying to sort out their affairs, but because of the occupational nature of the disease, they are entitled to a range of social benefits, but also civil compensation. So they may be navigating the healthcare system, the benefit system, and the legal system, feeling absolutely dreadfully ill and knowing that they possibly and most likely will die within a year. So you can see how vulnerable and needy these patients are. There have been no national guidelines really by the NHS for this disease. Thankfully, the BTS have published guidelines, and we are getting to a point where we can address that. Mostly there's been no guidelines because there's been very little evidence, because there's been no research into the disease. There are limited treatment options. We still only have one licensed treatment for the treatment of mesothelioma in the UK. We're hoping that will change later this year. There's a huge variation in practice. Some consultants will just think it's mesothelioma, what's the point? There's a bottle of morphine and on you go. And other people will pull out every stop and do everything they can to support these patients. So huge variation in terms of what patients are offered. And yet behind this are people who have never heard of the disease. They hear the word cancer and they have exactly the same expectation as any cancer patient. So if you imagine a 30, 40-year-old breast cancer patient who has every expectation that you know what you're talking about, you've treated this disease, lots of people with this disease, you've got treatments to offer me, you can cure me, and I'm hoping I'm not going to die. That's the average expectation of a breast cancer patient. A mesothelioma patient has exactly that same expectation. They expect us to be expert, to know what we're doing, and to have things that we can offer. And sadly, that's not always the case. So I'm sorry it's a bleak picture, but that's the realities of what it's like to be diagnosed with mesothelioma. And just to go back to that same Cancer Research UK statistic table, 2,700 cases on average between the years of 2015 and 2017. I remember I said it's unrelenting. The vast majority of those people will die. Only 7% of people with mesothelioma will survive 5 years or more. And I can tell you 60% will die within a year. And 94% of mesotheliomas are preventable. And asbestos is the one cause that we try to address. So this is, I told you that you can get it of the peritoneum, the abdomen, and the chest cavity. Its vast majority of cases are in the chest cavity, 90+%, somewhere between 5 and 10% in the abdominal cavity. And there is a 0.00 something % of cases of testicular cancer. The lining of the testicles is the same mesothelial membrane material or structure that we see in the chest cavity and the abdominal cavity, but it breaks off when a baby is forming in the uterus. So it's not attached to the lining of the chest, the abdominal cavity, or obviously the chest cavity. And that is why it is very rare for you to get mesothelioma of the testes. Somehow we believe that the asbestos has to penetrate, the testes in order to create it. So I'm very unusual. I look after only mesothelioma patients and have done for 20 years, but nearly now. And I currently have 3 men that I look after with testicular meso, but I work in a very specialist meso practice. Most of our meso nurses have never seen a case of testicular meso. This is just a map of the UK. I need to speed up, and just shows you the incidence, the hotspots. So asbestos, not found in our soil, all imported. So our major estuaries and ports. But then there's also areas of interest also areas of industry and construction and so on. It is in the top 20 of cancer incidents, deaths, in the UK. But if you look, right next to us is melanoma or cancer of the uterus or myeloma. Most people have heard of these kind of cancers. Very many people will not have heard of mesothelioma. This is a graph that shows our imports of asbestos and our plotted incidence of mesothelioma with a time lag of 20, 30 years in between. It takes 20, 30, 40 years for the asbestos to do the damage and result in mesothelioma. But this just directly demonstrates the correlation between our imports and our incidence of asbestos, of mesothelioma, asbestos and mesothelioma. The survival, as I said, 7% will survive 3 years, more than 60% will die within a year. So a couple of patient stories now. I told you about Mags Portman, and you can, Google Mags, really inspirational woman, very, very sad when she died of mesothelioma. I hope you can hear this. This is a gentleman I looked after quite a number of years ago, very typical. He didn't even like being an electrician, if I'm honest, but very typical of the experience of many young apprentices.
I was born in 1969. I worked in the industry, the electrical installation industry. The guys that were pulling out the pipe pretended to be wearing masks, but that didn't necessarily mean anything to me at 16. You do what you're told when you're 16 and you're an apprentice.
So very sad. He was a young dad. I think he survived maybe 2 years after he was diagnosed and died in his early 40s. This is another patient. You can look Liam up. Does quite a lot of fundraising for various meso causes. He's very active on social media. Again, a young dad, works full time. Really inspirational young man. And again, most people think mesothelioma is a disease of older men. Listen to Liam's story.
Hi, my name's Liam Bradley, and I was diagnosed with terminal pleural mesothelioma February 2017 at the grand old age of 30. This was massive to me and my family and friends. Massive shock. Cried for weeks, as you can imagine. You think every day's your last. But we learned to plough through that. We learned to stand up, dust ourselves down and get on with it. And we didn't do that by ourselves. We did that with help from Professor Fennell, Liz Darlison, and their whole team of nurses, all from Mesothelioma UK. And I refuse to be a statistic. So now I want to give back. I want to contribute to long-term treatments, a cure, more nurses, more research, because I've got faith in Mesothelioma UK and the whole team. And like I said, I refuse to be a statistic, but I can't do this by myself. I've had support from local businesses and my local community, friends and family, but I need more, and we need money to support me. We need money to support Mesothelioma UK. Let's get these treatments. Let's get this cure. Let's get this. But we don't want to be giving compensation out all the time, because that doesn't give you memories. That just, to me, that is not good enough. Compensation is not the answer. You can have all the money in the world, but memories with your friends and family is worth more than anything. And that's what we need to give the families that are suffering with mesothelioma within their families, including myself. We need to give memories, and years, not money, because that don't solve anything. So thank you for listening. Thank you very much.
So sadly, unlike Andrew and Mags, who succumbed to their diagnosis within a very short period of time, thankfully Liam's doing really well. He's had another daughter since he was diagnosed, went back to work full time, and looks after his fitness, and he's just a delight, really. So, and long may that continue. And he's a real strong advocate and supporter of Meso UK. Have to say, forgive my dogs that then, I don't know if you heard that, but Liam's got a couple of dogs and they were barking very distantly in the background, and it made mine get up and start growling and looking out the window to see who was about. So that's as much as I'm going to say, really, about to really paint a picture of the mesothelioma community and what's happening out there. But I just want to I've got a couple of minutes. I just want to tell you a little bit about Mesothelioma UK. And again, just to reiterate, thank you so much for choosing to support us. And I hope this gives you a flavour of the charity and our dedication, first and foremost, to patients and people living with meso, but also to the doctors and nurses out there caring for them. We try our best to support them, to make them the very best they can be for the patients and families that they're caring for. And we're also really dedicated to the NHS as well, and trying to make the NHS the very best it can be for people living with and being diagnosed with meso. So it is a national charity. It's a one-stop shop. That's what we aim to be for everything and anything related to meso, whether that's education, support, information, driving up standards, making sure it doesn't matter where you are in the UK, that you get the same standard of care. We want to really remove that kind of variation in clinical practice and the postcode lottery that sadly sometimes exists. We fund an awful lot of audit and research, and do all we can to raise the profile of meso and asbestos and prevent future cases. These are some of our work streams that I won't go into in too much detail. You can look on the website and you can read all of what we do. But suffice to say, we are, as I say, very dedicated to the NHS and want to make sure that it doesn't matter where somebody pitches up with a mesothelioma diagnosis, that they will get the very best treatment and care that is available, irrespective of their location. These are some of the studies that we've funded. So from basic science to better understand the process of meso developing, to looking at treatments. These are, we've looked at studies that the Dr. Beth Taylor there was about breaking bad news. So we explored how people were told they'd got mesothelioma and then wrote some good practice guidelines for healthcare professionals. We've looked at how best to live well with mesothelioma, decision making in meso. So these are more social kind of research studies. And again, I've explained to you about the gender experience of mesothelioma and the one with healthcare workers, and then also the MIME study looking at mesothelioma in our armed forces. So again, just really trying to shine a light on all aspects of mesothelioma and make sure that we are doing all we can to address those people that are affected. At the tour de force of the charity. Oh, beg your pardon. Sorry about that. The tour de force really of the charity are our nurse specialists, and we have currently, Lorraine's on the call, so she'd be better talking to this than I, but we have 34 nurses working in the NHS dedicated to mesothelioma, and they are based from Inverness to Plymouth, right down in Kent, Wales, over to the east in Cambridge, and we are currently talking to Northern Ireland, as that's the only one of our nations that we don't have a nurse, and we're hoping to get one established there. We're hopeful to get more in the future. The nurses, I should say, we also have 3 benefits advisors. So we have a benefits advisors down here in the south, one in the Midlands in our main office, and one up in the northeast, who specialise in the benefits and financial entitlements of people with mesothelioma. So each of our nurses, sorry, I couldn't move it on then. Each of our nurses, as I say, are employed by the NHS but funded by us. Each nurse costs us around about, or give or take, £25,000 per year. Each of them is responsible for a local caseload. They're also responsible for their region, and the country's divided up into healthcare regions. The NHS does that, and they're responsible for their region for really spreading the gospel about everything and anything related to meso, and really honing in on that equitable, fair access to the best treatment and care. And then they also have a role to support the charity with some of the national services we provide and supporting the research and education and audit. This is a picture of some of our nurses taken some time ago. As I say, we're up to 34 now, and I think we've got another 1 or 2 starting over this year. We think we need somewhere around 38 or 40 to have the whole country covered. So I'm not going to dwell too much more on the charity. Be very happy to talk to any of you individually. Suffice to say, mesothelioma is a UK disaster that isn't going to go away. For us as a charity, our current income is about 1.4 million, and that's how we manage to fund the research. We fund patient travel, national audit, and our team of 34 nurses. We're based in Leicester, but as I say, we have the nurse all over the country. Our aim ultimately to ensure we have fair distribution of our services and cover the whole of the country is to get our income up to 3 million. If we did that, we would be able to achieve that 38, 40 nurses, and we'd also be able to fund research up to around about £1 million a year, which would really enable us to start to do some hard biological and research to really understand the disease better and to fund some clinical trials. We're looking to further develop the national audit that we currently fund, and as I said, hoping to get up to 38 nurses. And if last slide, think about how you might help. We already have by saying that, you know, you've chosen us as a charity you're going to support for this forthcoming year, which is wonderful. But please register with the charity as being interested, so we can keep you posted and up to date with current projects and news from the mesothelioma community. Link with us and share our postings on social media, and tell us what we could do to help you and support you and how we can help you. Please use our resources. We've got lots of resources about asbestos and the diseases it causes, so please do use those resources. Recommend us to your teams and people you come into contact with, and really champion our cause. And if anybody would like to engage with our fundraising events, we have lots of companies, big and small, that support us and, you know, just do fundraising events, sponsored walks, or cake sales in their offices and so on like that. And we would be glad to support you with any of that. So I think that's all I need to say. I hope I've not gone over too much. And again, just like to thank the committee for inviting us to come and present. And I hope I get to meet some of you, or at least you get to meet some of our nurses in person in the future.
All right. Thank you very much, Liz. That was, I know you said it was going to be a bit sort of dire and doom and gloom, but you know, that's the reality, isn't it? So it is something that I think all of us recognise anyway, but it's still useful being able to sort of see examples of exactly what it does look like, you know, whether it's with sort of like slides from x-rays, or whether it's the people that have, you know, have suffered and are still suffering as well. So no, I think it was invaluable, because I know I said at the beginning, it's, you know, trying to focus everybody's minds on, you know, why are we doing what we're doing? You know, it is to try and sort of stop this, you know, continual sort of, you know, exposure of people. And there's been plenty of sort of comments going in the chat as well about the sort of levels that we monitor to currently, and we generally don't get down low enough to be at, you know, a stage where we think, yes, we think we've eliminated the risk. And at the moment, that still seems to be borne out by some of the death rates that we're seeing coming through. But I can see Lorraine's on screen now as well. I mean, don't know if you wanted to just say hello, Lorraine.
Yeah, thank you for that invite. I mean, you can see why Liz Darlison has an MBE, can't you? You know, it just shines out of her, really. She's such a professional. But, you know, I just wanted to say that we are experts and you are all experts, and just listening to the presentations today, we both learn and we both grow and share from each other, and it's been fabulous to listen in. And whatever we can do, whatever you can do to make the situation better can only help. And some of the audience may know that I interviewed Colette a couple of weeks ago. Interviews are always painful when you know they're going out on social media and all around the globe. But during the interview, I was completely blown away from what she was saying to me, and I know from the responses since then. So the more that we can all do to spread the word about what we're trying to improve here, and you know, the chats, as Liz has been talking throughout the morning, has just brought all those different points into line. And you know, it's just amazing, isn't it, that, you know, we can come together in this sort of forum and we can go away from it better informed, better people, really, and with so much more knowledge to take forward. So thanks for inviting us.